Hi, welcome back to Chapter 3, External Assessment Part 2. Here we're moving in to talk more depth to the rivalry among competing firms. This is the most powerful of the five forces that we discussed in in Part 1 of the lecture. So when we look at some of the major things to focus on when we're talking about the rivalry among competing firms, one thing is the number of competing firms. If it's very high, there's a lot more competition. When competing firms are of similar size, so if you're one of 10 medium-sized companies, a lot more competition. And firms that are in the same size and scope as your company typically will be a bigger rival. When competing firms have similar capabilities, when basically have the same capacity to make products with the high quality, high brand, with not a lot of the distinguishing differences in competitive advantages. It's going to be high competition. Demand for the industry's products is changing rapidly. So if the product is evolving quickly, it gives the opportunity of rivals to make a better version or get to the changes faster than you. When price cuts are common in the industry, so if you work in an industry where price cuts are very common, and this could be, it's going to be a very competitive environment if people are cutting prices and reducing profits. It's going to make it very hard for some companies to stay in business. When consumers can switch brands easily, so in some products, consumers can switch brands easily when it comes to some consumer products. Other products like cigarettes, even though it seems like consumers could switch brands, typically prefer the brand they're used to smoking and have a brand loyalty to it. So when there's less brand loyalty, then that's going to make it more competitive to keep your business and your customers. When barriers to entry to the market are high, this just means it's difficult for new firms to set up a competing business. So this would lead to a little bit more protective. So if you have a business like the auto industry where it's really difficult for someone to scale up and compete, that would say barriers to entry are high. So when we're talking about barriers to entry are low, that means it's easier for competition to set up shop and compete with you quickly. When barriers to leaving the market are high, this is when it's so costly to leave the business that companies will stay in business even at a loss, because it's even more of a loss to get out of the business, to exit the business. When fixed costs are high among competing firms, so if your fixed costs are high, then that just means you might be a little bit more competitive when it comes to pricing or sales increases or increase in expansion of your revenues, because you're trying to maintain and pay for those high fixed costs. When products are perishable or have short product life cycles, specifically food, even fashion has shorter life cycles now. It makes it a lot more competitive, because if you fall flat on your choices of fashion for that cycle, you could really be left out of the market very quickly. And these are all conditions that can cause a lot of competition. Now, when we talk about the potential of new competitors, this really is talking about how easy is it for a new competitor to come in. And this is where we really want to talk about the barriers to entry. Because if the barriers are significantly, one of the barriers could be the amount of money you need to get into the business, to buy all the equipment, make all the factories, spend all the advertising. And we also have to think about, the quality of the products, the pricing, the marketing. These can overcome some of the barriers. So if you just have, if a new competition comes in and their marketing is excellent or their pricing is very low compared to yours, this can, lead to a lot of extra competition. So barriers to entry, as far as, when we talk about economies of scale, it means making and selling enough product to cover your fixed costs. So if you're one of the reasons that the semiconductor industry has a high barrier to entry, because these foundations cost billions of dollars to make these foundations that make computer chips. And you have to ramp up to a huge amount of sales of these computer chips, these integrated circuits, to pay for the fixed cost of that foundry. So if you need to gain economies of scale quickly, you often result to lowering prices to get those your products sold, because it's just too expensive to have it unsold. So the need to gain technology and be specialized know-how, that could be a barrier to entry. If it's a very technical industry with a very complex product, that could be a big barrier to entry. So that's why when you talk about manufacturers that can make airplanes, there's very few of them, because the technology and the specialized know-how to make a plane is very high. So that's why there's only really two big companies, Airbus and Boeing, that makes a vast majority of the world's commercial airplanes. Lack of experience. So some industries just require a lot of experience to become competitive. So if it's an industry that requires a lot of experience, that lack of experience can become a barrier. Strong customer loyalty. If your customers are very loyal to your product, some of the most loyal customers are to Coke and Pepsi, even where people will fight about which soda is better. This strong brand loyalty in their products makes it very difficult for anybody else to develop a new cola beverage and compete in the soft drink market. So customer loyalty goes along with the strong brand preferences, where people get branded for either Coke or Pepsi or a particular type of cigarette. Large capital requirements is a barrier to entry, because it takes a lot of money to make the factory or to get the equipment to make the products. So those are capital requirements, money requirements. It's very expensive to get into an industry. It's going to keep a lot of competitors out. Lacking adequate distribution channels. If you might be able to make a good product, but if you can't get it on the shelf, that could be a barrier to entry. So say for the soda industry, Coke and Pepsi buy up all the shelf space. So it makes it very difficult for any competitors in the soda area to get shelf space on the stores to sell their products. Okay. Government regulation policies. Sometimes their regulations can be so daunting and expensive that keeps out other competition. Tariffs. If tariffs are very high on your product, that may limit, could limit or expand competition depending on which way the tariff is going. Lack of access to raw materials could be a barrier to entry, meaning that, say, we're talking tariffs and raw materials at the same particular point. If you're a company and you need to import certain components from abroad, or you need certain raw materials that aren't easily accessible locally, that could be a big barrier to entry. If your company's relying on those inputs, maybe it's energy, maybe it's raw materials to make steel or concrete. Possession of patents. If some companies like drug companies may have patents on drugs, and if you don't have access to those patents, or the drugs aren't generic, you can't compete. By law, the patents are giving them an exclusionary period when they're the only ones that can produce that drug. Or if you have patents on certain know-how of certain equipment or machines, then you can't use that or make one your own, because it's already patented. You have to buy it from them. Undesirable locations, counterattack by entrenched firms, potential saturation of the market. These are all potential barriers to entry, or think of barriers to entry as these are things that would dissuade another company or new company to move into your particular area and compete, because it's just too complicated, too expensive, too involved, too competitive. Now, another is the potential development of substitute products. So now, what is a substitute product? This is when, you want to draft a letter. So you could either use a pencil, or a substitute product could be a pen, but you're not going to use both. Or you can use a computer and type it out and print it out. So a substitute product could be, think of it like this. If you have a car from Honda, Toyota, if you're buying a car from Toyota, is not a substitute product. They're both automobiles. But if you go with a bicycle for transportation instead, that's a substitute product. So if the switching costs are low, then consumers might just switch to an alternate product. So it could be either buying records, which are CDs, or streaming the music. So that would be a substitute product. I can either buy the record and own it and play it whenever I want, or I could have a subscription to a streaming service. So there are types of substitute products. So the potential development of substitute products can be very damaging to the competition and the nature of the industry. So I guess you could say streaming movies is a substitute product for buying Blu-ray discs, maybe even a substitute product for buying cable. Okay, bargaining power of suppliers as far as one of the 5 forces. And this really, when you talk about a supplier, this is someone or a company you're buying your supplies from, whether it's raw materials or semi-finished goods or fixed goods. There's going to be a supplier who's going to provide your company with some aspect of the product you're selling. Now, if you are reliant on one supplier, they have more bargaining power. They can raise the prices on you. You have fewer choices to switch to somebody else. So when there's few suppliers, that is dangerous because now you're relying on 1 or 2 or 3 companies to supply the materials you need. When there's, so the bargaining power increases if there's few suppliers, if there's few substitutes, you can't substitute for a different component. And the cost of switching may be too high because maybe your particular machine is optimized to use this particular ingredient, and switching to another ingredient would mean that all your factories and machines would not be useful. It's sort of like why, the switching cost to switch from, say you have a gasoline engine and you want to be able to have a car that can use 100% ethanol fuel. There's going to be a cost. You have to buy a whole new car if you want to use that fuel. So the switching costs are too high to really make you want to, even though ethanol might be cheaper to put in your vehicle, the switching costs are way too hard to switch to that. Now, backwards integration is a way of controlling ownership of suppliers, and that's really, when you say backwards integration, it's think of the video game industry where when you buy a new Xbox, backward integration would mean that you can play the old video games from the previous 2 systems on your current system. But then again, the whole point of this is that if the supplier, the company supplying you your vital raw materials, if they have more control over the supply and you have fewer options, then they have more control over you and the prices they set for you. Now, there's also the bargaining power of consumers. So if you have only a few customers and it's very concentrated, and these few customers are making up a large percentage of your sales, they're going to have more power and more power for concessions, more power looking for bigger discounts, looking for special packaging. Like they can demand a lot more. So consumer power is higher where products are standard or undifferentiated. So basically, if a consumer could go to anybody else to buy it and there's really no difference to them, then they have a lot more bargaining power because they can, either buy home heating oil from your company or one of several other companies. So if there's no real difference, it's all the same diesel fuel, they'll go with who's ever the cheapest. So conditions where consumers gain bargaining power. So if the buyer can inexpensively switch, then they have some power because they can always threaten you with not buying your product because they could, for little to no money, they can switch to a different product. If buyers are particularly important, so if you have a buyer that is buying 25% of your product, they're going to be important to your company, and they can gain power and look for more demands, usually in the form of discounts on the price. If sellers are struggling in the face of falling consumer demand, so if the demand is falling for their product and you really have to please the current customers you have left. If buyers are informed about sellers' products, prices, and costs. So if a buyer is just really knows their prices, knows the products and the costs, then they could, basically say, listen, this only cost you $1 and you're trying to sell it to me for $10. That's not fair. Then they have some more insight. And this is something Walmart typically does when they buy from their suppliers, is they know the cost of the supplier's products and they can demand that they cut their prices based on the fact they know they're still making a profit. If buyers have discretion whether and when they purchase the product. So if it's a product that they could delay, or if it's a product where they have more control of the timing, then the consumer has more power. So sources of external information. So now you're a company and you want to get this information. What are my do an external assessment. There are definitely some unpublished surveys, market research. There are professionals that speak at meetings and seminars and research conference. There's television programs, interviews, conversations, stakeholders. This is one source of unpublished information. And then there's, of course, the very more common published sources of strategic information, including periodicals, journals, reports, government documents, abstracts, books, directories, newspapers, manuals, where they can help gather the information they need. Here's a list of some of the external sources. You might recognize some of these databases where companies can get more information about their competitors and the external environment that they're competing in. Now, another tool or technique that can be used is forecasts. So these are educated assumptions about the future trends and events that will help forecast how many products will be sold. And of course, these are guesses. They're educated guesses and they're never perfect, but software has come a long way. Experience of certain managers and past sales trends and just past records and the data analytics have helped forecasts become much more accurate. And of course, it helps if you have a stable, repeating economy. Forecasts can be much more reliable. But if you have a big event that causes consumers to cut back or shift their buying priorities and then resume them, it's very difficult to maintain those forecasts. And that's something that with this supply chain disruptions, that the inability to forecast properly was a big part of the supply chain disruptions. You can make assumptions, which, your estimates of the impact these external factors will have on the sale of your products. A lot of managers may have little to no control over certain external factors like interest rates and inflation. And some things they may have more significant control. But it all remains to see what's going to have the most impact on performance of the company and the desired results. So assumptions can be made. The industry analysis, as far as the external factor evaluation, the EFE matrix, is going to summarize social, cultural, demographic, economic, environmental, political, governmental, legal, technological, and competitive factors. So this is an industry analysis that's really going to be an in-depth analysis of the external environment. Now, the steps in the EFE matrix would be: 1, list 20 key external factors, put a weight on each factor between 0 and 1, rate the effectiveness of the current strategies from 1 to 4, multiply weight times the rating, and then sum the weighted results. And here's an example of the movie theater, Cineplex complex. So looking at 2 new neighborhoods developing 3 miles away. So that's a significant score. University expanding annually at 6% with a lot of nice college students who want to go to the movies. Major competitors across town that recently closed. Demand for going to the movies basically is growing. Disposable income is growing. The county itself is growing in population. So disposable income and the county is growing. Unemployment rate is declining. These were given a particular weight and a rating and then a weighted score. As we go through the rest of it, the trends toward healthy eating, demands for online movies, commercial properties, university installing on-campus movie theaters, sales taxes, regional groups, and their effect on condemning R-rated movies. And various other factors. So basically they multiply them across, add them together, and get this matrix score. Now, the industry analysis, competitive matrix, profile matrix, the CPM, competitive profile matrix, this identifies a firm's major competitors in their strengths and weaknesses. And the relationship to the firm's strategic position. So your strategic position compared to the competitors and their strengths and weaknesses. So it's what we call critical success factors, which include both internal and external issues. So here's an example of this competitive profile matrix. So we're looking at the weight of advertising, global expansion, financial position management, product quality, customer loyalty, price competitiveness, and market share. So we put a particular weight on those, a ranking, and multiplying them across, we get a score. And we could, so this would be this company, company 1, company 2, company 3. So we could see which company here, and there's the note that the rating value, 1 is response is poor, response is average, response is above average, response is superior. So it's really rating how these companies do in each of these areas to see which company is the most competitive. So again, we're just summing that up. Now, if we look at the how to gain a sustainable competitive advantage, again, we come to this wheel, which we used before, establishing a clear mission, we talked about, and then formulating strategies, which is, this is part of collecting and analyzing the data, which is the internal and external assessment is part of that, and using these data to make a clear strategic plan, implementing the plan, evaluating, and then redeveloping your strategic vision. Okay, so that's the end of part 2, and I look forward to starting chapter 4 when we're going to, in more depth, look at the internal assessment, which is looking inward at a company rather than looking outward at the company. Okay, so I look forward to talking to you then. Take care.